Is lesson 2 of the authentic French baguette, making as authentic as you can in Madison, Wisconsin. So we're not exactly in France, but still. We are on lesson 2. This is the knead. The need for kneading is important in bread, but I have a few comments about that, so we'll talk about that as we get into it. Remember what I mentioned about the description of bread as being a bunch of flour kind of suspended in water and then all these elastic sheets, the gluten that sort of holds it together. So we'll talk about that as we knead. That's one of the reasons why I like using bread flour, because it's got a little bit higher gluten content. Okay, so can everybody hear? Is we okay? All right, so Kath is just going to mute everybody, and I'm going to take my poolish out of the oven to get started. I mean, it was just there, rising overnight, and we'll see what that looks like. We're going to add the rest of the ingredients, and then we're going to knead the bread into our shape, and then we're going to put it back into the bowl for the next rise, which will be an hour and a half, and then we'll meet up again. So let's see what it looks like. I can't today, especially because we're working on a counter and we're going to be kneading. It's real important that everything be clean. So kind of at the last minute, you know, either with a sponge or just with a damp cloth or even a dry cloth, I just make sure that I didn't get any dust or anything like that on the countertop. And I'm looking at my bread here. Take all this off. And yeah, it looks really good. Let's switch the cameras. And are you recording?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to bring this up to the, you can see it's nice and wobbly. It's got lots of bubbles in there. It just really kind of puffed up. Looks like it kind of rose up about halfway the side. I think Cliff or somebody was asking yesterday what happens if it rises up. If it rose up too high, if it had come up and like, you know, stuck to your towel on the underside of the towel, no big deal. Just don't use that towel, you know, for the next steps, but it won't harm the bread. If you do actually get any poolish stuck to the bottom of the towel, it's actually easier to take it off, like with your fingernails, or scrape it with a knife or something like that. It's pretty elastic, so it kind of comes off like silly putty or something. If you just put it straight in the sink, it'll turn into glue and it gets a lot harder to get off. So tip if you got the poolish there. So I'm going to mix the remainder of the contents into this bowl. And then we're going to dump the bowl out onto the countertop to knead it.
I cannot hear you.
I don't know. Somebody was texting that they can't hear me from Betty. I don't know how to change it.
That was earlier, Joe. We can hear you now.
Okay, got it. All right. So what we're going to use today are the same ingredients we had yesterday. We're going to use some warm water, and we're going to use the rest of the flour, and then also using salt. I just happen to have coarse kosher salt here, but regular table salt works fine. I haven't tried it with like really coarse, like rock salt. I'd be maybe a tiny bit worried that wouldn't dissolve fully, but any kind of salt seems to work okay. And one thing about the mix, so the full recipe that we used and the half recipe, the way that we set it up, that's a little bit on, it's a kind of a middle of the road recipe in terms of the total humidity of the dough, the wetness of the dough. I think that over time, as one practices doing this, you should strive to go for slightly wetter and wetter dough. It's a little harder to work with. It sticks to your hands, it sticks to the countertop. You got to not grab it as long, kind of let go of it a lot. So if you feel real comfortable already working with kind of damp dough, then I'm going to actually, in my run here, I'm going to use a little bit more water than the recipe calls for. If you feel like you're just kind of getting the beginnings of getting used to bread, then just use the recipe as we actually have. Okay, so I'm going to push this to the side a little bit, get my bowls ready, and the first thing I'm going to do is weigh out my salt. So I got my scale on, I tare my scale, yep, and then we're calling for 28 grams of salt, which is about 5 tablespoons. Again, it doesn't, you can add a little more salt to make it a little bit saltier. It brings the flavor out a little bit more. If you add a little less salt, it's just slightly less salty in flavor, but it doesn't seem to harm the cooking process that much. So if you feel like you want really, really flavorful salty bread, you know, feel free to add an extra tablespoon or half tablespoon of salt. So I'm just going to go with the recipe here, which is 28 grams. That's about it right there.
So did you mean teaspoons or tablespoons for that?
Teaspoons. Yeah,
Okay.
5 teaspoons is is for the full recipe. Okay, so that's that. And now I'm going to weigh out. Actually, I'm going to use the bigger bowl for the rest of my flour. And again, I'm tearing this again because the bowl weighs a little different. We got somebody else coming. All right, somebody else is joining us. Okay, so if you remember the whole recipe, and I'm just still working in grams, but the whole recipe was calling for 1,200 grams of flour, which is 9 cups. And yesterday we did about 500 grams of flour into the starter. So I've got 700 left to go. So, for whoever it was that just came in, this is a little bit what the poolish looks like as it came out of the fridge. It's pretty bubbly. Sorry, fridge. I mean the oven. It wasn't a warm oven, just sitting there. And so it's pretty, pretty gushy. I think Colleen mentioned yesterday that the mix to her felt about the consistency of oatmeal. That's definitely a good description from last night. Better than I think pancake dough, which I was saying is a little light. Okay, so I'm measuring out 700 grams of flour. Again, you don't have to be absolutely precise. I mean, give or take 10 grams is not going to make that much difference. We're going to end up adding a bunch of flour anyway as we work on this. I'm just kind of watching my scale. That's like 720, 705. Okay, so that's my 700 grams. And I'm going to add the salt to that just so I can mix that together. And I'm just going to throw a couple of big handfuls of flour into this bowl. So I've got a bowl on the side just to work with so I don't have to keep reaching into the flour bag with my wet hand. So if I got a bowl, it's maybe a cup or so of flour just to the side, and then put the big bag away. Okay, so we have our flour. It doesn't matter too much, but I'm just using my hand a little bit just to mix the salt into the flour a tiny bit. It'll probably mix in anyway, but it's all good enough. Okay, and so now I'm going to put.
How many cups?
Sorry?
How many cups, Joe, please? Do cups, for those of us who are...
So the flour was 5 1/4 cups if you're making that full recipe.
No, today, 3 3/4.
No, today 5 1/4 cups. Yesterday, if you made the full recipe, yesterday you would have put in 3 3/4 cups. That's 500 grams, or 3 3/4 cups, so a little less than, considerably less than half. And today, the other half of it. So today, the recipe would be 5 1/4 cups of flour, 5 teaspoons of salt mixed in together, an extra cup or thereabouts, half a cup, whatever, in a side bowl just to use on your hands and as we start kneading. And then I'm going to put in warm water, 200 grams is what the recipe calls for. That's 3/4 of a cup. I've also, by the way, got a little bit of butter just sitting out. You can use butter. I'm just letting it soften a tiny bit. Or you can use oil. This is just because when we throw the kneaded bread at the end of this whole stage back into our bowl, I'm going to want to oil or butter the inside of the bowl. So if you're using oil, obviously room temperature. I mean, obviously it's liquid. If you're using butter, I'm just kind of letting it warm up a little bit. Doesn't matter that much. Okay, so now I'm just going to get some warm water, that same kind of temperature, like water that you would wash your hands in, not super scaldingly hot and not tepid. So I'm just running it in the sink, and then I'll fill this bowl. Actually, I guess I could tear my scale first. So, and we're going to add, so this is the, I guess I'll point this out. The recipe that we sent around calls for 200 grams of water. And that, like I said, is a kind of a middle of the road stickiness in the dough. I'm actually going to go ahead and add 250 grams, which would be maybe a cup and a little bit, just because I like to work with a little bit of a wetter dough. And like I said, you should try to eventually get yourself to where you can work with a wetter dough. The real recipe that I usually use, instead of 1,200 grams flour, 750 grams of water, I usually use 1,200 flour and 800 grams of water. But again, it's just kind of a feel thing. Okay, so I have my scale taired. I'm just going to get warm water from the sink. Okay, we'll see how that guess was. So 385, take a little bit of this out. So that's 255. Okay, so that's my water. Again, if you're doing in cups, it would be, where am I, 3/4 of a cup of water. Okay, so we have our warm water, we have our flour that's already got the salt mixed into it, and we're ready to go. So hopefully everybody's following along. I'm gonna get my scale out of the way. And the first thing I'm gonna do is just take the warm water all by itself and add it to the poolish, just to kind of mix in a little and let that sort of open up. Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna need my big giant spoon. Okay, so I've got this just in the poolish, just sitting there. Kind of made a heart somehow, that's sort of nice. Love you guys. So now I've got my flour and my salt already mixed in, and so I'm just gonna mix that straight in. And I'm kind of keeping my countertop clean. We'll do this, we'll clean it one more time when we really start to get going. And so first stage, we're just gonna mix it with a spoon in the bowl. And you kind of mix this about as long as you can. Eventually, it's gonna get so sticky that it'll be pretty hard to mix it by hand. It should have, so I'm just being careful in the beginning as I'm mixing it so that I don't get throw flour everywhere. Usually you can tell when somebody's been baking bread because every surface of the kitchen has like a little bit of flour on it. And so first thing I'm kind of noticing as I'm pulling this, see what this is looking like. It's already real elastic, right? You can see all that gluten, the sheets of gluten have already kind of formed nicely. And that's one of the nice things about working with a poolish. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but the poolish that we're doing now is for this reason. It gives a nice structure to the bread. It really helps to make that kind of gluten structure. But if you don't want to do a 2-day process, there's no reason why you can't just start today, mix all the ingredients at the same time, and then just get started that way. So you could easily cut the poolish stage out. You could do just all the ingredients at once today, and then do 2 rises, which is what we're gonna do anyway. And the bread will still be very, very good. I just like the poolish method because it's one more step and more things to do in life. And then because it's just a little bit better in terms of the flavor and the structure.
200 grams of water is actually almost a cup. That's an error.
Kath is pointing out that 200 grams of water is almost a cup, and that the instructions that we sent to people that said, this printed set here, said 700 grams flour, 200 grams of water, which would be the instructions said 3 cups of water, but I guess that's a little bit of a mistake. It should have been about a cup of water. So if you were doing cups and you added 3/4 of a cup, just go ahead and throw in an extra 1/4 cup of water. Okay, so I'm just mixing this by hand. I use a pretty stiff spoon. Like sometimes I had one day when I had one of these kind of little skinny kitchen spoons and I just broke it in half. So, eventually you can invest in it's more like a sort of Neanderthal spoon if you want. And one thing I'm getting to is the description, the word that I've seen used a lot about what the dough should look like is shaggy. It'll start to get this consistency. You can sort of see some of this here. I've got this kind of shaggy look, and it means that it's kind of shredding as it falls. It's still pretty wet here. I'm just trying to stir it into a ball. Sometimes you can throw it and just turn it over to get, you can kind of keep it off of there. In general, with wet dough, you don't, and we'll keep reiterating this, you don't really want to hold on to it too long. It'll stick to your hands. And so you kind of want to be touching it lightly and then just releasing it. And I'm just kind of taking it off of the spoon and just keep dumping that in. At some point, we're gonna just stop mixing it in the bowl once it's picked up all the flour. I still have a little bit of loose flour in the bottom, so I'm just trying to get all of that mixed up, and it'll form this kind of shaggy ball that won't really mix too much anymore. Incidentally, if you do the half recipe, you could do all of this in a KitchenAid. I used to do that a lot. So you could take that, I think this full recipe is probably a little too big for a KitchenAid, but if you did the half recipe, you could just start with your flour and salt and mix the yeast and water in a separate bowl like we did yesterday, but just do all the ingredients. put all the flour and salt into the KitchenAid, start it with one of those mixing paddles or a dough hook, and then just keep adding the water. So you could do that if you don't want the arm workout, you know, but we're all stuck at home, so we might as well move our triceps a little bit. Okay, so I'm pretty much about as far as I can get with the mixing in the bowl. Okay, and I have this sort of, again, it's kind of, shaggy is this word that I'm using. It's not, it's, you know, you can see it's still pretty gluten-y. It's, I don't know any other way to really describe it, but this is kind of the consistency that I have. I can just about pick it up, and you can see it's kind of this sort of a look, okay? So I'm just gonna move this to the side just a sec and make sure that my counter is clean by pushing everything on the floor. Sorry, Kath. Partly because I don't obviously want to get any kind of dirt in this, and also because mostly what I have on here is water and flour, and I don't want the dough to stick all that much. Okay, so I got that, and then just from the touching of the dough, I've got some flour on my hands, and so it's not that much. I'll just take it off. But if you've got a lot of flour on your hands, then you could wash your hands, because it works. It's easier to work with wet dough when your hands are clean. Okay, so now we're going to do the knead, and the first thing I'm going to do is grab a little bit of my flour and just throw it on the countertop. A lot, a little, doesn't matter, and I'm flouring my hands. And what we're doing here, okay, remember back to this idea that the bread is this expanding structure that's being held together by gluten. So we're trying to get the gluten to be in sheets instead of in strings, and we're trying to fold a lot of air into the dough. And there's a ton of different ways that people use to knead dough. And I'm using this kind of weird hybrid that I sort of made up myself based on some of the experiences that I had with my French friend that I mentioned yesterday. So a lot of people will think of dough as like punching it, beating it down, smashing it. And that's not really the right attitude you want to have. You're not trying to drive air out of, or you're not trying to flatten the dough and drive air out of it. You're actually trying to fold air into it and stretch the gluten. So I'll show you what this looks like for me. So now I'm just dumping this whole thing out, if it will come, or just grabbing it out onto the counter. You can see it's pretty wet. And then I've got a little bit more dough in here, so no sense wasting flour. I'll just grab some of that and stick it on. And at this point, if you are, I have a second bowl that I'm going to use for the next rise, but it's not necessary. I'm just doing it for the purposes of this video. Normally, I would use this same bowl. And if you're doing that right now, while the dough is sitting on the counter, take your bowl and put it in the sink and fill it with warm water. So that'll help you to clean it, because we're going to want to clean this out to use it for our rise. The warm water will help dissolve all of this, flour that's in here, and also it'll warm up the bowl, which I think, especially in these slightly cool times of year, and even any time, is pretty helpful. So I'm just going to put this in the sink. Okay, so I have my dough on the countertop. You can see it's still nice and wet here. I've got, just put a little flour in my hands, put a little flour on top of it, make sure I've got flour under it, okay? And so now I'm gonna start a process of kneading it. And I will say that in the time that I've been working on dough, I found that the biggest mistake I was making early was I was over kneading the dough a lot. Like I read somewhere that you should knead like 7 minutes or 12 minutes. I probably knead the dough only 3 or 5 minutes today. So we'll see how it feels. All right, so I'm just starting it. And the one thing I like to do is stretch the dough. So let me see if I can show you this. I'm trying to like hold it and then hang it, letting it use its own weight to stretch it out. So I get this kind of long thing. And then fold it over, smash that down a little bit, stretch this side, fold it over, smash that down a little bit. My palms are getting a little sticky, so I'm just gonna flour my palms again. Okay, if it's real wet on the bottom, I can just push some of the flour that I already have on the counter. If I don't have enough, I'll throw it down there. Okay, so I have something like this. So what I'm doing is I'm just getting to where I can grab the dough, I can hold it for pretty long and then just let it go. And it's still not really sticking to my hands that much. If you get the little granules, the little bits of flour, just rub it off on the side or just stick it back into the dough. Okay, so again, flattening it out, I'm using the palms of my hands and I'm trying to just smear it out like a pancake almost. And then I'm just gonna pick up one side of it, let it hang under its own weight, and then fold that in. Could be thirds, could be halves. You can come up with your own system. Smash that, let that stretch, and then fold. So every time I'm stretching it, I'm kind of making all of that gluten fall into or line up into sheets instead of strings. And then every time I fold it, I'm adding more air in between those sheets. And that's what we want. Ultimately, the dough, the bread is going to be a bunch of air pockets that are trapped in between lots and lots of layers of this gluten form. Okay, so it starts to form a little bit, stretch it a little bit. Okay, so you can use the sides of your hands like this. You can use the palms of your hands. You don't really want to grab the whole thing because your hands are going to get real sticky. I'm just continually flouring my hands. I'm flouring the countertop a little bit. And so right now you can see the consistency of the dough. Like I can hold it, you know, it's got plenty of bounce. You can see it's kind of coming back from when I poke holes in it. I'm still not done at all, but it's still pretty stretchy, right? So you can see about how damp it is. Okay, so smash it down, give it a little bit of a stretch, come back together. Let me move over here so you guys can see a little better. You get like these little clusters, you just poke it back into the bread. It's all just flour and water. So again, yeah, every time I'm doing this, I'm just folding a bunch of air in between these sheets, and eventually it'll get to you. I'm just keeping enough flour here that doesn't stick to the counter. I'm personally not really going to add any more flour at this point. Like my dough is already not really sticking to the counter that much. It's not sticking to my hands that much. I might just flour my hands ever so slightly, but I've added probably enough flour, and I'm just kind of poking this so you can see a little bit what the feel of it is like. If I were to hang it, it's starting to hold its shape a little bit more. And so I'm folding it, and oh, hey, the coffee pot is done. So eventually you get to the point where it's pretty difficult to do this anymore. Like it wants to be in a ball like that. I've probably been kneading it now for 2 minutes, 3 minutes maybe. 4 minutes, Kath is telling me. So it's still just got enough weight and stretchiness to it that when I pick it up, it will hang and stretch a little, but not much. I'm almost having to kind of shake it to get it to stretch out. And I got it to be about that long. Fold it again. So I just keep doing this, but I'm already seeing that it's becoming this kind of pillow, where as I smooth it out, you can see that it retracts again. So already that elasticity is starting to try to make it into a ball, okay? So I'm getting pretty close to done. How are you guys doing?
Hey, Joe.
Yep.
So I feel like my dough looks pretty similar to yours, but it has a little bit of lumpy feeling to it, as if there could be some flour lumps inside there. Is that fine?
That'll be fine. I mean, it'll all get wetted over time. We're still going to do 2 more rises, so it'll have plenty of chances to get kind of wet. You know, that's one of the benefits of doing the poolish, is that the yeast is evenly distributed. So the flour, I think it'll be fine. There's not a ton you can do about that. It's like, you know, the dough gets so heavy that you can't really mix super heavily. So what I'm seeing in Andrea, I'm seeing is that Solon?
Uh-huh. Yes, it is.
So that looks good. I think you guys want to add a little bit more flour. It still looks like it's sticking to your hands pretty well. So what you can do is, like, you could throw a bunch of flour on the countertop and then, you know, turn the dough over a couple of times onto that flour so it adds onto it, or just throw flour on top of it, right? And then keep it until, like mine is not really, see, I can grab it and it's not sticking to me. And so you should get to about that consistency. If I were to hold on it a really long time, it'll start to stick, but yours still looks a little bit shaggy. You want to get to where the outside is kind of pillowy. You know, it's a sort of a smooth skin now, and I can almost, you know, form this into a ball. It's still pretty elastic, so I want to get to about, you know, I'm still just able to stick to it here, but it's just about at this consistency where I can get it like this, right? So
What do you think of this one?
Sorry?
Can you see mine, Joe? This is Danielle.
Yeah.
Joe,
Yeah, that looks great. I mean, if you're able to hold it like that and then it's not sticking to your hands,
Yeah.
that looks awesome.
Okay.
Again, the the more you work with dough, the more you're able to work with a wet one. The French friend that I worked with, he worked with dough that was so wet, I couldn't do it. I mean, it was impossible. He was doing all these great, beautiful stretching activities, but every time I did it, it would just stick into my hands like crazy. So yeah, Andrea and Solon, that one's looking really good now. I think you guys are really getting close there.
Joe, I have a question, please, too.
Yes.
Look at my dough.
Still really wet.
Yeah,
So
what do I do?
that looks like something that got maybe mismeasured a little bit. If it's that wet on the countertop, I would put it back into the bowl and add some flour to it until you can really stir it into almost a ball.
Thank you.
It might have been, just are you working in cups, Gabi?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
I was confused, like my students. I was a little confused.
That's okay. I mean, you have plenty of yeast in there, so just be making a slightly bigger batch. It's no problem. I would just take all of what you've got in the counter, put it back in the bowl because it's real wet on your hands right now, and just put it back in the bowl and add flour until you get to that sort of shaggy consistency where when you're stirring it with a spoon, it's not like stirring soup, but you're actually almost able to be turning it over. It's like this big kind of wet dumpling inside the bowl. Once you add that much flour to it in the bowl, then you can drop it back out on the countertop and finish your kneading.
Thank you.
Okay, so this for me is about done. I'll just show you one more time. If I pound it out like that, I just got this pillow, and you can see that it kind of comes back. And so even if I tried to stretch it, I can just get it to be a little bit long. And again, not everybody uses this technique, but I'm just throwing a couple more folds on it, but this is definitely plenty enough for me. So I've got this nice bowl, this nice ball, and because I don't want it to stick to the counter, I'm just going to give it a little bed, a little pedestal of flour, a flour plinth, and then have it sit there while I grab my bowl. Okay, so I'm just going to, so at this point, you guys can either keep kneading if that's where you're at, or if you've gotten to this point, then if you're going to use the same bowl, then wash that bowl real well. You don't want to have any sticky flour on the sides of it, and dry it, and then we'll oil it here. Flour is very gluey. I'll tell you what, Kath, will you do this? And I can consult with people about their dough.
Sure. You want to use the other bowl?
Well, whichever one. So I'm gonna have Kath be my sous chef and do the cleaning. Does anybody else want to show their dough and see how it's looking? Hello, Maria.
Yeah, it wasn't very like elastic in the beginning. Like I would hold it and it wouldn't stretch that much, but now.
Yeah, it looks good. So poke a finger in it. Yeah, that looks awesome. And if you're able to hold it, that looks great. Yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Like it's not as smooth as yours was, but.
Yeah, that's okay. So, this is really just the initial mixing, and then we're gonna let it rise again, which will help all the yeast to start acting on all the flour and all the flour to get fully wet. We'll do another, it'll fluff up again and it'll be really soft, and then we'll do another round of like stretching, like a really quick knead almost, just to stretch it back into shape, and then we'll do another rise. So in that whole time, it'll get there.
So I could.
There's all these little differences between different kinds of flour. They're all slightly different, and then the recipe kind of varies from place to place, and so just getting used to it. But that looks great.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, everybody else ready enough? Yeah, I'll just do it. Okay, so I'm just going to use, let's see, how do I get back to
Pin yourself.
Oh, I should do this camera.
Yep. Let's see.
Okay, so I'm just, that's okay. If you have another bowl, you can use it, but I mean, normally I use the same one. I actually think that that the process of washing that bowl and using warm water on it helps. It helps to kind of have the bowl be this warm little space, you know, this warm little mini spot where the bread is going to be rising. I think that's kind of nice even in the summertime. So I'm just using a different bowl here for sake of convenience, but also it's nice to have a glass one for later so we can see what the bread looks like.
Yeah, I've got a
So
question.
we're almost done. Sorry, did somebody have a question?
Yeah, it's Cliff here.
Hi, Cliff.
Do you have any, what's your favorite way to clean dough out of a bowl?
Yes, it's tough. So I usually fill it up with warm water, and then I'm just using my hand in the warm water and literally just using my fingers to kind of keep wiping it off into the water. The bowl is totally full of water, and just kind of wiping all that dough loose in the, you know, in the sink in warm water until that all starts to come off, and then drain it out, and then there should be still little enough left that you can then use a sponge or something like that. The stuff around the edges always gets like really dry, and you know, flour and water is pretty gluey, so it's a little bit of a drag. But yeah, once you fill it up with warm water, and then you can mess around with it in there. By the way, the dough can just sit on the counter like this for a while. I mean, it doesn't really care. So if it takes you 10 minutes to clean your bowl or 20 minutes, you know, that's all fine.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay. So we're now basically done. I'm going to I'm going to oil the inside of my bowl kind of liberally. If you're using, you can use olive oil, you can use regular oil. In this case, I'm just using butter, just taking a little bit of it on a paper towel and just, you know, smearing it around. The dough is going to sit on the bottom, of course, but it's going to rise up the sides, and I'd kind of rather not have it stick to the sides. And the oil, frankly, adds a little bit of flavor too. I've done both. Olive oil, you can taste the difference. It's really good. I like them both. So I'm just sort of lightly oiling that. So I've got my bowl, you know, kind of oily. And I'm taking the dough. I don't think it makes all that much difference, you know, where you set it down, but I'm kind of in the habit always of like peeling the sides up and folding them in. Make sure I'm on this. So I'm kind of making a little pillow like this. So I've got all that seam in the bottom, and then turning it over and just kind of stretching this. And this is the beginning of a thing that we're going to do. I'm pulling this top around the side a little bit, and I'm putting that dough into the bottom like this. So I'm kind of stretching and shoving this dough up into the middle, just a little bit, not a ton, but so it's trying to make for me a skin on the top. And that's going to become real important later as we start to shape. For the moment, I'm just making it so my skin side is up and my kind of puckered side is down. I don't know that that makes all that much difference at this point, but then just drop it in there. Good luck, little buddy. Take that same towel. If you got a bunch of poolish stuck to your towel, then just use a fresh one. You know, cover the top of it and put your lid on. And then you can leave it, you know, wherever it was that you had it rise before, you can leave it to rise there. And in this, so I'm in Wisconsin, it's like 40, 50 degrees outside. In the fall, I'm usually going to do like an hour and 40 or an hour and 45 minute rise. And so we'll be back in an hour and 40. But in the summertime, when it's warmer, when the countertop's warmer, when everything is warmer, you can usually get away with like an hour and a half of a rise.
No, I don't.
Okay. So, so I think that's the end of lesson number 2, the knead. Hopefully your dough is like nice and got a little bit of a skin on it. It's nice and spongy. Throw it into the into your bowl with the towel on top, and we're ready to just let it sit for an hour and 45 minutes. So that's the end of this lesson. I'm just going to stop the recording, and then we can just keep on chatting if anybody's got questions or whatever.